Practices that we've come across and that we suggest for developers who are building on top of the Microsoft Identity Platform. So the practices we're going to go through, first off, I have some golden rules for tokens that everyone should be following. As you know, it's all about tokens as a developer. So what are the rules that you should follow with respect to tokens? What are some of your options available for creating a great user experience by how you use scopes? We're going to talk about using roles and groups for authorization, enabling provisioning, so that you also some best practices around protecting APIs and services, as well as protecting your apps. All of these things are things that you should be thinking about as you go through with your application development. So let's start with the golden rules for tokens. This is a real interesting point because we get a lot of questions about tokens. You know, can I do this? Can I do that? Where can I get them? And so on. And while I'm not going to talk about how you acquire a token, the easiest thing is to simply use one of our MSOL libraries, or perhaps a middle tier library like ASP.NET or ASP.NET Core. What I do want to go through is the nature of what you're trying to do with the tokens, how can you use them, and so forth. The transaction for all of authentication and authorization is relatively straightforward. You ask for a token. You go to the identity provider, in this case, Microsoft Identity, and you say, can I have a token to identify the user? Or can I have a token to call an API with a particular range of operation? So that's the mechanics. Those are the transactions, if you will. But what kinds of things should you be thinking about with respect to how you use and work with these tokens? The first off is that you should only use tokens for their intended function. So if you ask someone, I need to identify the user, please give me an ID token, you shouldn't be saying, oh, I'm going to use this for something else. Our most common breakage here is people who say, well, I have an ID token, that should be enough. I'm going to use this ID token for something else. The only purpose of an ID token is to simply identify who the user is to that application, and it shouldn't be used for any other purposes. Similarly, an access token is used for also only one thing. You acquire an access token in order to allow the application access to the data on behalf of the user, or possibly if you're working as a client credential app on behalf of the application itself. Right, so this is what's authorizing or allowing the developer of the application, the system that is that application itself, access to the information. It doesn't have anything to do with the user, but it has everything to do with the access by the developer and the application. And the only purpose of that token is to authorize you to call a particular API with a particular range of operation. The next rule is the one that I think gets broken most often, which is never mess with someone else's token. Tokens are issued to a particular audience, if you will. Inside of every token is an audience. And when you acquire a token, you know whether you're acquiring a token for yourself or acquiring a token for an API you're about to call. So it's a pretty easy rule that you should never mess with someone else's tokens. Well, how do we see this rule being broken? The first thing we see, unfortunately, commonly, is an app will ask for an access token so that the application can call a particular API, and then just go ahead and look inside that access token. The application acquires an access token intended to be delivered to an API. That token belongs to the API, not to the application, not to that developer, right? And we see this kind of behavior frequently where a developer will look and say, well, but I saw all this interesting stuff in the access token that's going to this API, so I'm going to make a decision in my code based on information of this token that really isn't mine, but it looks like it's good information. So I'm warning you against the practice for a couple of reasons. First off, at any point in time, it's possible that you'll lose access to that access token. They might become encrypted. We might change to a different format. There's nothing saying in the standards what we have to do with respect to the format of that token. So you can't rely on that. The second thing, you can't rely on what's in the token because at any point in time, the API designer might say, hey, I don't need that anymore. Or I'm going to change what the claims I expect to see in my token. since you have no information about their desire to do so or when they make that change, your application is quite likely to break. So it's absolutely a best practice and one we see broken way too often. Applications trying to look inside those access tokens. I also, by that, mean validating or doing anything else with the access token. It has one purpose, one intended function, back to rule number one, which is to give it to an API as part of my API call, and that's it. Another way that people mess with someone else's tokens is APIs that take an ID token instead of an access token. Well, that token was not issued for the API, so it should always fail token validation from the API because the audience will not be the API's audience. It will be the application's audience. So it should absolutely always fail that straightforward validation. It also, one of the main reasons we want to harp on this particular thing is we see developers all the time saying, well, all I want to really know is if the user signed in. Well, but what you're taking away here is, first off, you're saying my API is not going to be secure, right? So there's no way to secure my specific API. So if a customer or user said, given some particular situation we've had, we need to restrict access to this API, well, they can't do it because there's nothing to control your API with because it doesn't have an access token. You're taking any ID token that comes your way. Right, so you're effectively saying, well, I don't want any protection of my API, in which case you might as well not implement any. Another common way somebody messes with someone else's token is they'll take an access token, but from some other API. Most commonly, folks will say things like, well, if they have a token to Microsoft Graph, that's enough for me. Well, it still comes down to you're not protecting your API at all. You're hoping that maybe there's some difficulty or some security bar that you have to reach to get an access token to Microsoft Graph, some of which are really easy to get because they're very limited scope, limited capability tokens. So this is a common way that this rule gets broken, but it is a simple rule. Never mess with someone else's tokens. And if you follow that, there's lots of places you would have these. We sometimes get questioned. Hey, would it be all right if I used an ID token instead of an access token? Well, frankly, since it breaks golden rule number 2, no. So if you follow these two golden rules, you often will answer the questions you might have of, is it okay if I do something that's not quite what I think it is supposed to be? Another behavior we see applications doing and falling into, if you will, is they will often or sometimes not cache tokens appropriately. All of our tokens are issued in the JOT format today, which JSON Web Token, which means that they're good until they expire. So if we give you a JOT token that's good for an hour, you shouldn't be asking us for the same JOT token, if you will, the same nature of token to call, say, the same API a minute later. It's just not the appropriate use of the tokens that we issue. It also could lead your application to being throttled because you continuously ask for something that you have already acquired. So there's no way for us to determine whether that was intentional behavior, unintentional behavior, a bug, or anything else. So we issue tokens with a particular range of time frame that they're allowed in and when they expire, and you need to cache those tokens to make sure you're not putting additional load on the system, both our system and yours. There's no point in you making a bunch of round-trip calls to get tokens that you didn't need to do because you already had a perfectly valid token. Of course, all of our MSOL libraries that handle access tokens, etc., handle the caching of tokens automatically, but if you're doing a different library or on a different platform, I encourage you to make sure that the caching of the tokens is done correctly. And the final golden rule is when you get an error back from trying to acquire a token, you do have to gracefully handle the fact that you didn't get the token. But instead of going and coding up a lot of things on a specific error code, you need to look for the error classes instead. So for example, don't code for something that says, I need to have, the user hasn't consented to this to this request, which is a particular interaction. You go to ask for an access token, consent has not been granted, So we would come back and say, well, we need to talk to the user about consent. We also have a class which says user interaction required. So the number 4 or 5 different ways that we might need to speak to the user, their password expired, that hasn't been consented, etc., all wrap up into one block of code you have to actually implement, which is user interaction required? So we have a golden path, if you will, acquire token silently. If user interaction is required, which is really a class of errors, then acquire our token interactively. That's a golden pattern in MSOL for us, and the key there is that we're checking for an error class instead of error code. So there are not a whole lot of rules here, but if you follow the rules, you'll find yourself staying on the right path and not necessarily doing things that could be opening up vulnerabilities that you're not aware of. So one of the things that I often get back from is, no, I have to look in the access token. It's absolutely required, because how else am I going to know why I'm getting an access denied when I call the API, right? So, hey, as a debugging technique, we should all learn how to look into access tokens. The real problem with that is, at some point in time, if we start encrypting these tokens, you're not going to have access to that token. You won't be able to look at it to debug, right? So there's no point building a whole skill set and getting used to the pattern of, the way I debug is I go off and I look inside the access token to figure it out. You need to find a better way. And frankly, we have one already built in. I'm going to switch over to a little app I have that lets me look at tokens and such. And then let me go ahead and I'll sign in once my network catches up to me. So I'll just sign in as myself in this demo tenant we have. Sure, if I look at the ID token, I'll get all of the information I expect out of an ID token. Specifically, my audience is my application, so I know it's my token. I'm allowed to mess with this. Here's my preferred username, as well as things like my object ID, which tells me exactly which user this is. Now, that's not helping me if I need to call the profile API and I get access denied. But if I look at the token response, this is the actual HTTP transaction response that we got from that web request to get the token in the first place. You'll see a lot of interesting information that not only can help me debug, but help me understand what's going on a little bit more. So the first thing we tell folks is, well, here's the user. By the way, this is where the user is natively homed, if you will. So I have, if this was a guest user, I could see information about which Active Directory, or whether a consumer or not, where this user actually came from. The key element people want for their debugging is, what scopes are in this token? Well, we tell you what scopes are in the token without you having to open the token to find out. Similarly, another key element is, when does this token expire? So by looking at the token response, instead of trying to dissect into the token, you really have all the information you need in order to try to figure out, why are you getting that access denied when you supplied, say, this access token to an API. I will point out another reason you really want to look inside the token response is this correlation ID. This is something you should absolutely be logging and tracking. If you ever thought, well, I really can't figure out why this operation isn't occurring, and you decide to open a support ticket or try to contact us to help, if we have the correlation ID, we have a chance of going back and finding out what happened during that authentication or authorization request. If all you say is, well, when the user types this doesn't come back, we don't really have anything to really work with that much. So the correlation ID, which is not in a token, it's only in the token response, is something you absolutely want to keep track of and log, for example, as you move through. So there isn't a need to crack open an access token if all you need to do is get information like what scopes are in the token, so you could go ahead and continue your debugging process. So permission and consent. This is an area that really is key. There's two key factors for me as a developer as I look at using the Microsoft Identity Platform. One is, all of my transactions are about, I ask for a token and I deal with either getting a response or not getting a response. So that's my transactional process throughout everything I do with the Microsoft Identity Platform. The second thing is, I control the experience by how I use the permission and consent framework. Now, one first item here is, remember, permissions are only about the app or the developer or the app code or whatever you want to say. they have nothing to do with the user. So don't try to be thinking, well, I have to, if I get a permission, that means my app can be used for this. If you get a delegated permission, then it doesn't mean the app will work for that. It only means that if the user can, your app can be used for that. So remember that permissions and consent are always about just the user, or sorry, the application developer, and never the user. And that is in absolutely true, even if you're asking for a on behalf of permission, the delegated permission as we refer to them. So all that they do is permissions. They authorize your API to call a particular. They authorize your app to call a particular API with a particular range of operation, which is referred to as the scope parameter. Right. So I like to call it a range of operation than a particular limitation, in that it, depending upon the nature of the scope, it can broaden your capabilities. It could restrict them. It could give you some very specific functionality. For example, our user.readbasic.all lets you read all of the users in the tenant, but not all of the information about all of the users. It's restricted to only 7 or so properties of the user that you can have. Given the fact that the API designer has said, I want to design this by having a scope for my permission model, what the API designer is saying is, I want to have the permission and consent experience, or approval process if you prefer, attached to the ability for an application developer to have access to this information. So if we look at Microsoft Graph, we have made the decision that before an application developer is allowed to see the full user's profile, someone has to say that's okay. So when we use permissions and to call that API, when the API designer has said, I want to use scopes, they're saying, I want that user consent experience to come along. Whether it's user admin, they want that user experience. Of course, you should only ask for a scope or a permission or a range of operation for code that you have implemented. If you haven't implemented the ability to write, you shouldn't be asking for read-write. If you haven't written anything about groups, you certainly shouldn't be asking for any group permission, etc. Again, this is all about approving the developer's access to this information. So it's important you only ask for things that you're actually implemented. So if you haven't implemented the functionality, you shouldn't be asking for that permission, right? And that's what we refer to as a least privileged permission. If all I'm going to do is read, I should only ask for read. This allows two things. First off, it lets your user trust that you've done a good job of implementation. It also allows an IT pro to manage who gets access to what and so on, right? So it is also one other thing. It also means that if somehow your application was compromised, no one can use your application's identity to do something you didn't intend to, right? So if I found a way to exploit your application to say, hey, I should be able to do writes with this code, if your application hasn't asked permission to write, it can't be altered, it can't be hijacked in a way that would allow it to do something the developer didn't intend. So this is where you as a developer request that permission. Now, some of the new things that are coming in permission and are changing the user experience, one of them is we're having much more granular consent available to tenant admins. So as we move forward today, they have a very hard and fast switch. Either user consent is allowed or user consent is not allowed. But going forward, they'll be able to make those decisions on a more permission by permission basis. What this means is, and this is true even today, it's just at a more granular scale going forward, even though you as a developer have done your work and you've gone to the Graph API, for example, and seen that this permission requires admin consent and that permission doesn't, and you've tried to keep within only a particular set of user permissions or user consentable permissions, the tenant admins have the ability, even today, although they can only do all, to say these permissions are okay for a user to consent to and these permissions are not. So you have to develop your code under the assumption that given any particular consent request, any permission scope on an access token request could be denied because admin permission is required. It also means that they could turn around and turn off admin consent at some point as well. So you as a developer can't really always know ahead of time if any scope you're using is really going to be admin consent or not. So it's always important, therefore, that you handle not getting that access token gracefully, right? If you have an access token that you absolutely have to have in order for your application to function at all, and that's denied, then you're going to have to tell the user that they can't use this application for that capability because the consent was not applied. So the simple transaction, you ask for a token, you always have to be ready for the response being no, you can't have that token. Another thing that is coming is there's now an admin consent workflow that's in public preview today. What that allows to happen is instead of the user seeing something that used to say admin required, so I would ask for permission. Let's say it was always an admin consent required permission like user.read.all. If my application asks for user.read.all, any user who wasn't an admin would get this relatively harsh dialog that says admin required. And they may not know who their admin is, they don't know how to get past that, and that can be difficult. So instead, what we're adding to in public preview today is the ability for this to actually start a workflow instead. So instead of the user just seeing admin required, they would say, well, I'll show you, it requests what can happen. Now, one of the other things I really want to stress here is that you as a developer are completely in charge of one aspect of the user experience, and that's when is the developer going to be prompted for what consent items. So let's start by going ahead here and we'll sign this user out. And let's look at the code behind this application. So it's a very straightforward process for me as a developer to figure out how I'm going to make these API calls to Microsoft Graph. So what I've done, because I'm a very simple developer, is I've just said, well, here's the API I'm going to call. I'm going to call the standard user profile API, the sort of heart and soul of Microsoft Graph, the me API. And I know for what I need here is user.read, because all I'm going to do is read the current user's profile. So I go off and call that API with our standard acquire token silent. If interaction is required, go ahead and acquire token interactively. The key element here is scopes, which I'm just passing into this application. So this is the range of operation I want. So what I'm relying here on is the MSOL libraries to figure out at any point in time if I have to acquire another permission or not. So I'll start with user.read. And then if I want to go ahead and call the people API, here's the people API, me/people. The consent I'll need will be people.read, the scope, and so on. So this makes it very easy as an application developer to figure out, to keep my scopes, if you will, closely associated with the API call I'm going to make. Now, if I go ahead and run this application, which is the state I'm in now, I get the ability, so we'll go ahead and sign the user in, and I'll sign in as Microsoft Identity. I should have signed them in first, so let me do, I could have anyway. So I have my ID token. It's Kyle from this demo tenant. I can check my tenant response. I've got my user.read profile. And of course, I get the profile information from the user. So that's exactly what I would expect. Now, I'll go ahead and call the people API, me/people. Unfortunately, since the developer went ahead and said, I'm not going to keep track of permissions, I'll just ask every time. When I come back to sign in as Kyle here, now I have a permission consent. So every user will have to continually get hit by these permission requested dialogues, these consent dialogues, because the developer said, I'm only going to ask for one thing up front, and then from there, I'm just going to go ahead and ask them on an incremental basis. Incremental consent can be very powerful in that it allows you to be able to do this kind of user interface, but it's more targeted at you should do it only when you really need to, as opposed to sort of a default choice. So let's sign Kyle out here. I didn't grant that permission. So we'll sign Kyle out. And one of the things I can do with this little app is I can change my startup profile consent. So one option here, if we look back at the code, is I just do an incremental consent, if you will, every time I need a permission. and I'll let MSolve figure out if there's any actual thing under the covers that needs to happen there. So my alternative is to run this application, and I can set what I want to see the user to see during sign-in time. So one great choice of when you sign the user in is to say, well, what should they consent to as soon as they start the application? So I could, for example, do what I'm doing now, which is just the user profile user.read, or I could ask for only the permissions that this app has that only require user consent. So that would be user.read and people.read. I could say I want everything I know, for example. If I know all of the permissions I might use, I could ask for everything this way. An alternative spin on that is to use something called static consent. Static consent says go to the application registration, and whatever is listed under the application registration under API permissions that the application could use that instead. And the way I specify that as a developer is I give it my application ID /.default, and that tells the Microsoft Identity Platform to go off and figure out what all the permissions have been declared for this application and use those. Let's change that. We'll go ahead here and we'll go to our user consent items. So when the user signs in, they'll be prompted for user.read and people.read. So we'll go back in here. We'll sign in Kyle again from this demo tenant. Now I still get a different permission requested because the last time Kyle ran it, he only consented to reading the user profile, not this read relevant people list. So I will go ahead and accept that. And now, if I were to sign out again and sign Kyle back in again, I've already pre-consented, or I've already consented to those two, so I won't get an additional prompt. I shouldn't have. I need to accept. I did last time. I'll go ahead and call the people API, and I get a function. So if I call the profile API, things work. If I call the people API, things work without an additional consent grant. But if I call the groups API, I will get an additional prompt because, of course, in this case, I'm asking for something for both admin consent and that I haven't actually wasn't given to me in my initial sign-in experience. So here I'll go ahead, and this is the new workflow. Instead of it saying admin required up top, it now says approval is required. And here I could type in a justification about what I need, and I can send that request off for approval. So now instead of the user being stuck going, I don't know how to get past this, they could launch a workflow, and then that request will be sent off to the people who can grant that permission and head back. Now, my particular application at this point is still going to get a result back that says you don't have user consent here, but at least the process is underway and the user isn't stuck. So if the user come back later, maybe they granted that consent and we can move on. So as you can see, a developer is in charge of what the user experience is by how they use things like what's the sign-in scope, what will the user see up front, and when I ask for incremental consent, or even if I want to go ahead and use static consent based on that as well. So you are completely in charge of what the user experience is with respect to when they see consent prompts and what they could expect to see there. And it's a key area for you to pay attention to develop a great user experience for your users. So one of the other things that we can do in tokens is that we can provide information to you as a developer about things we refer to as roles and groups. Right? The idea here is that you want to have part of your app that's available to some classes of user and parts of your apps that are associated to other parts of user. The simplest example, for example, is maybe you want to have someone who can submit claims and you want someone who can approve claims. Right? So those are two types of functionality in your app, and you have to figure out, given a particular user who's signed in, how will I figure out if this user is a submitter or this user is an approver? Now, one option is you could use Microsoft Graph to get information about the user and figure out why the user should be an approver or a submitter based on that. In theory, it's possible to have very rich user classifications because you have a lot of ability to see lots of things about the user from their full user profile and other things that you could be using for Microsoft Graph. So one option is that you'll integrate deeply with Microsoft Graph in order to determine who should be what. another thing that you can do is simply ask the identity platform to say, can you tell me the user's roles or groups or both in the tokens you provide me? Now, I'm not saying ID or access tokens here because this information, this capability applies to both kinds of tokens. So I could be doing access tokens with this information, or I could be doing ID tokens with this information. So a developer can request that information, and it's available to both types of tokens. So let's go back into our demo app here, and we'll go ahead and actually, let's not do that one. I'm going to change my initial one just to the user consent items again, and we'll sign in Kyle. And here you can see that Kyle has, go back to my token claims here, that I have the group information for Kyle here in the token. So these are all of the groups that Kyle, who is a member of this tenant, you can see there's no IDP group claim here rather, so I can see that this is a user locally to this little demo tenant. And in this demo tenant, Kyle is a member of apparently 4 groups. So that's great. Now, the way that that this happened is because when I go to my application registration, I can look here. This is for the best practices demo. I can go here to its manifest and see that there's a claim. There's a property in here called group membership claims, and I've set that here on my application registration to all. So when the user signs in and I get an ID token for them, or when an application asks for an access token on behalf of this user for a particular API, I could change the group membership claims for an API registration as well. I'll see that group information right inside the token. So that can be very handy. The downsides here for group usage is, I don't know how many of you know the group name that you want, but all we give you is the GUID, so you'll have to provide the mapping between that. The other thing is, how do you know which group is interesting and which is not? Well, you'll also have to provide some UI in your application to say, hey, if you want submitters, tell me which group you want the user to be in if he's a submitter. You'll have to provide that UI functionality because we don't provide anything like that today. The alternative would be if you were closely associated with your IT department, you could say, well, we made up a group. Here's its ID, and they put anybody in that group who want to have this functionality. So that might work for line of business. It certainly won't work for an enterprise or for an ISV rather. So I'm going to sign out Kyle. So what we just signed in was we signed in Kyle from the local tenant. So I'm going to sign in again here. I'm going to do something interesting. Actually, let me back this off. We're going to not do that. I'm going to sign in specific users to this tenant. So this is the tenant that I want the users from. It happens to be the tenant where this application is registered. And I'm going to sign in users, and instead of using the common endpoint, I'm going to use this specific tenant ID endpoint, because what I want to do here is I'm going to sign in a user, but this time I'm going to sign in, I guess no one who signed in here yet before, we're going to sign in Kyle from the Microsoft tenant. So these are my corporate credentials, if you will. Instead of my credentials in that little test tenant that we were looking at. Of course, I have by default, a passwordless experience. So I'll have to go out to my phone and I will approve that passwordless experience by clicking on the right number here. So let my phone get its notification. Unfortunately, I have to rely on the Wi-Fi here for this. So that's hopefully we'll get that again. What I'm going to do is I am going to try it one more time, and if that doesn't kick in, let me, I'll sign in with a password, which I'll try to remember. Hopefully I'll get enough of a notification for my MFA to work on this network. So here again, so notice that I'm getting a permission and consent prompt. This is for the ability to use this app from the Microsoft tenant. I'm likely to get this rejected. Let's give this a try. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm signing in Kyle from Microsoft specifically to this demo tenant. So Kyle from Microsoft is allowed to sign into this tenant because he is a guest in this tenant. Also, Kyle from Microsoft happens to be a tenant admin in this tenant. So here you can see I as the guest in this tenant, I'm a guest administrator, I can consent for this on behalf of my whole organization. And if I were to click that, nobody will see these permissions needed to be prompted again for anyone in this tenant. So I'll go ahead and accept that. So if I look at the ID token that we'll get from here, we'll let that come up. Notice that I'm only in one group in this tenant. So there's Kyle from Microsoft, and he's only a member of one group, right? Because I'm only a tenant admin. I'm going to sign into this thing one more time. Then we switch back to profile. I'm going to go back to the common endpoint, so all users, and sign Kyle out of this test tenant. We'll go ahead. We're going to sign Kyle in again with my Microsoft identity. So there's my corporate identity. I'm effectively now signing into the corporate tenant to do this authentication. And now when I look at the ID token, notice what I get back for groups. I don't get any groups. So apparently Kyle's not a member of any groups in the Microsoft tenant. Well, that's unlikely. In fact, I'm a member of so many groups that it won't fit into a token. So instead, what I get here is, hey, this underscore claim underscore names claim says, if you're looking for a claim named groups, go to claim sources and look for a claim called SRC1. So that tells me I have to go to claim sources, which is this claim, find the SRC1 claim, and there it will give me an endpoint that I can use to call graph to find out what groups Kyle's a member of. So a couple of things here. First off, this will require admin consent in order to access it as an ISV, because I need group read all or directory read all for this permission. And the second thing is, notice I have to fall back to calling Microsoft Graph in order to actually find all the groups that Kyle's a member of. So that's not really a great way to do this functionality. So let's go. So groups work, they certainly are there, but they are bounded by this limitation. If you're using implicit flow, which this is not, you'd be limited to only 6 groups before an overage occurs. If you're using SAML, it's 150 groups and 200 groups if you're a regular OpenID Connect application. So you can see there is this sort of downside, if you will, to doing groups. So if I go back to my application registration, I can also see that I have this thing here, the property called app roles. And here, my allowed user type is user. So what this is saying is this application has defined 2 roles. It's defined a submitter role and an approver role. So what I could actually do, another way I could control this application is, let me go back up to, I'll go to this application's enterprise app entry, or service principal, if you will. And here, this is where an IT pro would be able to manage how this application works in the tenant. I'm going to go to users and groups, and I'm going to take Kyle. That will be this one. Let me find out if it's this one or not. So this is Kyle from that Microsoft test tenant. So I've got an icon here. So let me come here. I'm going to edit Kyle. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to, in order to edit this, I have to be a tenant admin. So let me switch over to my tenant admin account. I'll go to that same location once we get the network working, and we'll look for best practices here. Here we go. So I'll come to the best practices. I'm an IT pro now. I'm not an administrator in my demo tenant, so my regular user. So I have to go in as an IT pro to do this. I'll go to users and groups. I'll pick the Kyle whose icon is filled in. It should be this one. We'll edit Kyle. I could assign a new user as well, but I'll come in here, and now I have the ability to select a role for Kyle. And you see I have both approver and submitter. It's important that you define both, because even though submitter might be the default for this tenant, everybody gets to submit and only a few get to approve. If I turned on that users have to be assigned in order to be able to use this app, today any user can use the app. But if I, as an IT pro, say, you can only use this app if I assign you to it, I also have to assign you to a role. And if you don't have that default role, then it can be challenging. So I'll go ahead and make Kyle a submitter here, and then I can do that assignment. So that helps me do that. I can also, for example, add a new user to this application, and actually, it's not just users I can add. I can add users or groups. So any member of, so I can look at the groups. I can pick one of those. I can, let's see if I think I have sales. Oops, sorry about that. So I've got a sales group. If I pick the sales, I got Salesforce users. I could see anyone in sales. I can pick that user is in fact an approver, and I'm sure they'd love to be approvers. But I can make these assignments. Now I do need a subscription level of P1 in order to do these groups. If I wanted to do this with dynamic groups, I would do a P subscription, but it does allow me to do that functionality. So let's go back to the app, and we'll go ahead and sign Kyle out. And then we're going to come back in and sign in. And this was Kyle from the local tenant. And now I should, there we are, we see that Kyle gets a role claim of submitters. Roles is, I could get lots of them. I could be submitter and different ones, but there's two things here. Your application, even though I had defined the roles in my manifest, notice the first time I ran this app, or I didn't get a role. The reason I didn't get a role is I was never assigned one by the IT pro. So it's a valid case for you to always deal with. What if the roles I'm looking for aren't there? I have to say, well, if no roles are here, here's the default functionality for a user. But if there are roles defined, then I would add in whatever capability that role brings in for them. So this lets me do that through the roles. The nice thing there is you notice that ability to assign users to roles is UI. You don't have to write that. It's part of our portal. Therefore, we also have APIs that you can use in PowerShell or in Microsoft Graph to make those assignments as well. So it's you don't have to do any of that work to make your application be able to work with that, because we do that part as well. So for that reason, I tend to suggest roles a little bit more than groups because of these items that we already looked at, but I want to reiterate. We only use group IDs unless the group is synced from on-premise. You also have to do that UI that says, okay, given this group submitter, here's the group ID I'm going to use for that. So you'd have to have a groups.read.all in order to provide that functionality. And if you are using groups, we limit how many groups can show up in a token, as you saw, and you have to follow the right behavior to figure out when they're not there. And these are those limitations. And therefore, since if you're using groups and you have to fall back and do the implementation to use Graph, I always think it's just easier just then to go ahead and use Graph and not with the token, because I have to implement the Graph functionality anyway. Okay, so provisioning is a very important part of what a lot of our customers are looking for today. Oh, I see there's a question in the chat. What would be the scope if I use static consent? Let me quickly go back to the app here. If I wanted static consent for this application, the scope is the application's ID. So in this case, it's this GUID, 829, etc., followed by the slash and then .default. That scope says I want static consent. Okay, so going back to the presentation, the idea of provisioning is that you need to rely on the directory. Even line of business apps that are relying on the directory can often say, well, I'm just going to use Microsoft Graph because I know a lot about this directory. I'm just going to go ahead and find the information I need out of the directory. And that's a great choice. There was one issue there. We often refer to this as sort of just-in-time provisioning, in that as soon as a user shows up, you go and learn enough about them through something like the Microsoft Graph APIs to figure out your profile of the user for your application. One tricky bit there is you will have to figure out when a user disappears from the organization on how to do that. So that you can do that with something like, say, a webhook and Delta query on users so that you can see that the user changed or left or something. But it does require more consent, a higher consent, group read all, and access to all of the user's full profile and so on. But it is an option, especially a good one for line of business apps that often have everything pre-consented for them. the problem is if you require a complex onboarding of a user, it can be a little irritating the first time I sign in if it takes a bunch of time while I'm waiting around watching something spin on the screen while you're setting up that initial user profile for me. Similarly, for ISVs, you might want to support not just Microsoft Identity, but also identity providers from whatever your customer may be running. So one of the great things that you can use, therefore, is something called Azure AD Automatic Provisioning. So what will happen is the IT Pro will be able to set up rules that say, as soon as a user appears in this tenant, I want you to tell this application about the user. All right, so that all of that can happen automatically. And if I just take a quick look inside of my tenant, let me go in as a tenant admin. I'll go to Enterprise Applications. We have set up in this particular tenant the Salesforce application for automatic provisioning. So here is one of the items here is I can look at provisioning and see that Salesforce is set to automatic instead of manual. Wait for the network to show up here for a sec. And we configured what credentials, how we talk to Salesforce. That's a question of setting up how we can make that connection. We also configured mappings that say, well, given that Salesforce is looking for an attribute that says username, well, take that from our user principal name, and so on. So we set up default mappings for you so we can easily determine what to tell Salesforce or what to tell any application. And for things like, hey, do you want to watch when users are created or updated or deleted? What operations do you want me to tell this application about? And what can happen here is for things like, hey, when does this user leave the company? It's a bunch of work for you to do with Microsoft Graph, certainly doable, but work that you would need to do. Or you could say, why don't you tell me when a user leaves the company? Or why don't you tell me when a user changes his role so that he shouldn't have this functionality anymore? And the simple way you do that is by implementing what we refer to as a SCIM endpoint. SCIM is a standard. It's not our standard. It's being picked up across identity. So not only will you support this functionality for Microsoft identities, but you also support it across the board for everybody else as well. When you are protecting an API, unlike an application, APIs are all about actually looking inside and inspecting the access token. We do use JOT tokens for any access token we give to a third-party API today. So if you develop an API, you can expect to get a JOT token from us. These are good until they expire, unless you, as an API developer, don't implement that check, in which case they're good forever. So the enforcement of protecting an API all relies on the API implementer looking at the JOT token, validating it first for its signature, et cetera, and then looking at things like when does the token expire, and making sure that that is honored. Right, so you can validate the token without actually calling us. In fact, it's an interesting thing. APIs that are protected by Microsoft Identity never make a call to Microsoft Identity, right? But it's important that you do the token validation for signing. Make sure it's to your API. You are the audience. Make sure it's from an issuer you trust, and make sure that they're within the time span that the token's good for. If you find a well-maintained library that does JOT validation, that's your best bet here. But that's the way that you need to implement that code. And then you always have to make sure you use, if you are calling another API, to use the on behalf of flow to get a token from that other API, because given the golden rule number 2, never mess with someone else's tokens, you can't give your token to another API and expect it to work. And that other API should never have accepted a token that wasn't audience to that particular API. And then whatever's in the token is how you have to operate. You are responsible for when it's a delegated permission. What we're going to tell you is who is the user. We're going to say, here are the scopes that the app has been authorized. These are the range of operations the application has been authorized to perform. And if it has a user role or groups, we'll have those defined for you in that token as well. If it's an app permission, it has no user identity. It just has the roles for the app, which represent your app permissions. And then, of course, it would have any groups or user roles there as well. So for services, just the app permission roles. For services, make sure you always use a client credential and move away from service accounts. We did a lot of stuff with service accounts in the past. They're very troublesome nowadays in that you can't turn on MFA, you can't become a more secure environment without special casing every application that's being used as a service instead of a user. Now, I do know that there are some older APIs that don't yet support app permissions, but you can certainly hopefully work around that and move toward app permissions as soon as you can. I will point out that Exchange does have an ability for you to run a PowerShell script, so that instead of being able to read all mail in the enterprise, you could read specific mailboxes. When you're securing services, make sure you use certificates instead of client secrets. Secrets work fine, but managing secrets is troublesome. It's just a string. They tend to get checked into code or put in email or in files that are unencrypted. We prefer certificates because the management at least exists there. And finally, of course, if you're using Azure to run any of these services, use the managed identity for Azure resources. That way your developers don't have to do any secrets management or certificate management or anything else, and they don't have anything that they could actually lose. So there are no secrets to lose if you use that process. Finally, I want to talk about protecting your apps specifically. We are seeing attacks that are targeted specifically at applications and trying to break those applications. For the first thing, for example, is if you have, for the redirect URIs, this is the address you're telling us to send your token, make sure that you own that URI, that we're not sending it somewhere that somebody else might own or somebody else may be able to put up to intercept. Make sure that you own those redirects. Make sure that you're keeping your list well maintained. And if you move to a new redirect URI, you don't leave some unused or unnecessary redirect hanging out there. And that does include not being able to use wildcards. It opens all kinds of different security holes, which is why we don't allow their usage in the new UI and V2 endpoints. But we strongly encourage you not to use those. Those redirect URIs should be secure URIs, HTTPS, etc., so that they're secure and encrypted. That is where your tokens are going. So make sure that is what you provide. If you're using public clients or clients on things like iOS and Android primarily, there are specific platform-specific URIs for you to use, and they enable the communications between the default browser that's doing your collection of your single sign-on and signing in with your application, and they have code in there to help prevent randomness. If you have an isolated web agent, it is possible for you to use a very specific URI, but it is a big area of concern from us to make sure that you are maintaining and handling your URIs correctly. Another area here is passwords are bad. How this applies to apps is when you're using client secrets. If you're going to use client secrets instead of our preferred certificates or managed identity for Azure resources, make sure it's a strong password. There was an ability in the past to enter in weak passwords and people just left them. We have seen password spray attacks against applications. So make sure you have a strong, unguessable password to use as a secret key. Again, preferably use secret credentials. The idea behind all of this is to store them in a way that no human actually has to touch them on the way by. So if you use something like Azure Key Vault, that's a great way to go. A couple of other things: we are shifting all of our new work to MSOL libraries, the Microsoft Graph instead of Azure Active Directory Graph and the V2 endpoint. It's a good time for you to start thinking about. First off, all of your new applications should be written in MSOL and V2 instead of ADOL and V1. And start to think now about when you might be thinking of moving from ADOL to MSOL. We're not removing support or anything like that, but it is something for you to start thinking about in the back of your mind, that it would be a good project at some point to move forward from ADOL and V1 into MSOL and V2. We are providing a number of upgrade guides there as well. So I apologize, I'm a couple minutes late here, but that's a quick look at some best practices when you use the Microsoft Identity Platform. I'll stick around for questions, and I do appreciate all your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kyle. There was a question earlier that showed up with a delay on the chat window from Dean Gross. Are there any tools available for compliance or security IT pros so that they can use to evaluate apps to confirm that they're using any of the best practices that you're talking about?
It's something that we're starting on, but we don't have anything packaged up yet. But we are certainly starting to look at what could we do to help you find some of this information, like app or something simple like apps that don't have rotating secrets or something. But it is something we're working on to create a tool for that. Right now, all we have is the scripts that are out there. or the scripting languages.
Thank you. Feel free to ask any other questions. If not, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you having you here.
Hey, this is Daniel. I have one more question. Assuming that let's say I have a front end and the back end, I have a multitude of microservices, and the user triggers an action that needs to basically is going to require multiple actions on user behalf across many microservices. How do you recommend using this access token on user behalf? Can I share it between microservices? Can it go with the requests across, or?
Well, it depends upon the design of your microservices and exactly what their different logical points are. I mean, from one point of view, I could say, well, Microsoft Graph just happens is a microservice, right? Each individual workload, whether it's identity or Exchange, etc., they all have, are implemented on their own. They evolve at different time spans and deal with any interdependencies. We use one API family for all of Microsoft Graph, and therefore the access token can be shared. You can't share an access token if they go by different API identifiers. So if it's graph.microsoft.com versus kyle.microsoft.com, then I couldn't possibly share that access token because the designers have said these are two separate APIs. So in that case, you have to use the on behalf of. The only other option that we see out there is the possibility of adopting something along the lines of a trusted subsystem. Obviously, that becomes a lot more harder to maintain and deal with, but it is an option. So what you have to look at is, what's the right logical breakdown of these APIs? Are they one API with different workloads that are implemented by microservices, but really one API, in which case access tokens are the same? Or is it really a whole bunch of different services, right, that you're exposing with different API names? So that might dictate one top-level choice. And then the second one is whether or not, what are the interdependencies between these APIs? How often will one call another? If they're rapidly calling each other back and forth, it might be that you can live on the token cache with respect to how long they're issued. But it's a question of where your throughput concerns, I think, comes up for me, which is, should I move to something like a trusted subsystem? Well, that really means they're only calling amongst each other in a very, very controlled fashion. Or do I go with a series of different access tokens because they're that different?
How do they get the access token to work on behalf of?
If you go with the idea that I've got these collection of services, and I've decided that these are three different APIs, if one API needed to call another API, you would use what we refer to as the on behalf of flow. What you do is that first API takes the access token it was given and its own client credentials, goes back to Microsoft Identity and says, I'd like an access token to call this other API, please. And then we could issue that on behalf of token, so everything happens correctly, so that the second API that's called doesn't really see it has necessarily. I mean, it could check deeply to see if it came from another API, but it sees it as just a regular API call to itself.
And does it get all the claims supplied in the previous access token?
No, it gets the claims that that API designer said they need. So the two claims are independent of each other. So for example, if API 1 said, I want to see user roles for this API, and API 2 didn't say they wanted user roles, they wouldn't be there. But if API 2 said, I want to see groups, they would see groups. So each API designer decides what information they expect to see in the tokens they get.
I see. And then in this scenario, there will be no communication between application itself and those two APIs, because the second API may call another third API and then can leverage the on behalf flow, isn't it?
Yes, the assumption is the first API, the app has to call one of them, right? So some API gets called. Now that API may in turn say, I'm going to call a different API. Now there is an issue of consent. You have to make sure everything is consented, either by the application using something like the static consent, in which case we'll do all the consent math and ask up front, or there's a way for you to just do a similar level of functionality in the middle tier to say I want static consent, or the app would have to know it's going to call another API. But you do have to have the consent logic dealt with. Now, if it's a line of business app, you just have everything pre-consented and there's no issue whatsoever. But if you're an ISV, you would have to think about how am I going to get consented for all the different tiers of APIs I'm designing.
Is it the OAuth 2 workflow on behalf?
Yeah, it's effectively the OAuth 2 workflow on behalf of, and we have it documented. We have APIs available for you to use and something like MSOL that just make it easy as well.
Will you be able to post in Yammer group the URL to this document? After the meeting. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Great session. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Kyle. This is Priyan. So you have talked about the groups and associating roles to the groups and getting the groups in the token. So my question is ADAL or Azure AD supports nested groups?
So at this point, the groups that you get in the claim, I should have mentioned it, thanks for pointing it out, are the groups for whom this user is a top tier member only. If you need to find out nested groups, you'll have to use the Microsoft Graph API.
One more question on the same front. If the user is a part of a nested group, is that authentication, will it break?
It won't break authentication because we're not authenticating based on group membership. What we're doing is we're authenticating the user. The user says, I'm Kyle. Great. The provider, we think it is Kyle because he's got, say, the right MFA or whatever. And then we simply tell the app, here's the groups the user's in. So we authenticate. The user has proved who they are as one step. And the second thing is the application would like to know what groups this user is a member of. So you will never fail authentication because of that, but you'll get a different list of groups depending upon who the user is.
So if we have a group role membership and if the user is part of the tier 2, I mean the nested groups, and if that particular user is trying to log in, that means there won't be any role associated for that user, right?
It's a different thing. So if you assign, I'll have to double check this, but if you were to assign members of a group,
supported in Azure, isn't it? Nested groups are not supported in Azure AD, isn't it?
Well, we don't show you the nested groups in the claim for sure. That's really the big ticket item there, right? So the ability to see, the membership of a nested group claim in a token is definitely first tier only.
Yes. So, yeah, correct, Kyle. So my question is, more specific. Like I have an application and I have a group called test group 1, and inside that I have a nested group, test group 2. So the test group 1, I assigned a role called role 1. So if the user inside the test group 2, which is a nested group, if signed in to an application, so will that authentication succeed? Or
the auth will succeed whether you see the role or not. I have to double check. I don't think you will, but let me double check that.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
It will not.
Okay.
We tried that.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't think it would, but I wanted to double check that.
Okay, so in case if there is any role assignment, then if the user belongs to a nested group, then the authentication will fail. But if there
Not
is
the authentication, you won't see that role as a claim. They'll sign in just fine.
Authentication will work. Authorization will fail.
Well, even then, what'll happen is the token you get won't have that role in it.
Correct.
Right?
Authorization.
Authentication will work.
Yeah, so the user signs in fine. You'll get a token. Now you either get an access token or an ID token depending upon where this functionality is trying to get to. But what you'll end up with is when you inspect the token and look for the user's roles, it won't be there.
Correct. So the only issue that you will face in case of the user is only in the nested group is only that claim will not have the role membership. That's
they certainly still are allowed to sign in.
Okay. Thank you.
You bet.
And another question on that static scope that you have mentioned. So you have mentioned that if it is a static, you can mention the .default. So
yes.
When you specify that and when you get a token, that scope of that token will be .default, or is there any default scope?
It actually depends. We would. I've seen us return both in both cases, so it's something you have to look out for. But when you look at so actually, to be fair, in the scopes here, you can occasionally see that it's asking for default. But most of the time, we're pretty good about telling you all the individual scopes that it's doing.
Okay. And on a different topic, Kyle, so right now all our applications are using ADAL. So we are planning to migrate to MSAL. So is there any documentation on the code perspective and the library perspective on how to migrate an ADAL to an MSAL in .NET?
Yeah, we've got that in this. I don't remember where that slide is, but here, update to MSAL. We do have some guides here, and you see different levels of guides for different platforms, etc.
Yeah, I have gone through this, but is there, I mean, when I was using ADAL, there was a step-by-step guideline on how to migrate an existing app to ADAL, like you have to use this library, and if there is any version mismatch, you have to use this one. So there was a step-by-step guidance. So like that, is there any guidance on library? I mean, how to integrate that library if you are already using ADAL?
I don't have anything other than this at the moment, so if there's some things you'd like to see, it'd be good if you could send me some mail about it. I should have my email here somewhere. Let me see if it's on the first slide, and then we can see if we can get that addressed.
One more question on the same note. Like ADAL, we have a limitation that .NET library has to be greater than or equal to 4.5. So for MSAL, is it the same thing, or is there any restriction?
I'm sure it would have at least a 4.5. I don't believe it requires any newer versions of .NET.
Thanks, Kyle.
Okay.
All right, everyone, we're out of time. So thank you so much for calling in today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.